Hello, everyone. Good morning or earlier morning or afternoon as it may be. Welcome to the October 11th Gamma meeting of the Gateway API. As always, Kubernetes Code of Conduct rules are in effect, so please treat each other respectfully. And yeah, with that, looks like we don't really have much of an agenda today. But as always, the agenda is linked in the meeting notes. It's an open agenda, so if you have a topic you'd like to talk about, please feel free to add it. And yeah, I guess with that, I'll kind of like open the floor to if it would be helpful to like have a brief recap of like what we've been up to recently. I can try to summarize that. And then
Go for it.
Yeah,
We'll heckle if you get it wrong.
All right, that sounds good. And feel free to jot down anything that you want to expand on or talk about next. But yeah, so kind of like current state of things is we have a GEP proposing that it's actually a formal GEP now. It's been presented initially to this meeting a few weeks ago, and now it has like I guess 2 weeks ago it was presented upstream to the Gateway API full north-south group. It's proposing using HTTP route for traffic routing and splitting for mesh use cases. It specifically proposes how to bind to service as a parent ref, and that can be viewed. I will add that to the meeting notes so that can be found there. But yeah, I've had a few folks review it so far, and I'm currently in the process of iterating through feedback. Mostly just like minor tweaks and deleting some sections that were a little overambitious. So it feels like we're on good pace to hopefully get consensus on getting this merged in the relatively near future is my hope. Yeah, and yeah, I guess like kind of the other main focus of what we went over last week was surrounding like what do we do next. So there was some talk about well, I guess a lot of talk about authorization policy and figuring out how to do auth-z, as that's kind of like a core mesh concern of having one service be authorized to talk to another service and how we should approach modeling that. We have a lot of options for that. And I think like kind of one of the things we were trying to tease out was figuring out, do we need to figure out auth-n, authentication, like how a service identifies itself first? And kind of where we ended up was hopefully not. It seems like service account is kind of a lowest common denominator that almost every mesh that is participating in Gamma is able to use as a authentication for services. So just like kind of skipping that part with that assumption baked in for now, it's kind of the hope, and then focusing on auth-z and being able to revisit that in the future if and when it becomes necessary or valuable, particularly like as we look at yeah, expanding use cases and stuff like that. But yeah, that was kind of a brief summary, and definitely if you're interested in that, feel free to read through meeting notes from last week or check out the recording. And yeah, one of the other things that I started a like brief outline of, but have not had much time to flesh out yet, is kind of proposals for how to integrate the Gamma work and traffic routing rules for meshes with the north-south gateway API rules, and what should or should not happen, either implicitly or explicitly. There's kind of two main paths there. And that's going to be really important, just to make sure that we don't end up with two divergent implementations that sort of use the same constructs rather than having something that is cohesive and works well together. Whew. All right, so that's a mouthful, and I'm gonna take a break to have a sip of water now. But yeah, if anybody wants to lead off from that or has questions or wants to expand on there, please go ahead.
That last bit about north-south stuff, that's your Google Doc about exposing mesh services through gateways? Okay. I'm gonna post the link to that one too, just in case. By which I mean, just in case there's anybody in the call who hasn't seen that one.
Oh, so there's also a PR for this, right? Which one should we comment on? The PR and the Google Doc?
There's a PR for HTTP route within the mesh, right? But there's not yet a
Yes.
PR for the north-south integration.
That is correct. Yeah. For the
yes. Okay.
yeah, for
Okay.
the first one, we've moved out of the Google Doc and into the PR, and I'll link that as the first one in the meeting notes. And then yeah, the next step, the like integration with Gateway, that one's still just an early draft of Google Doc. So
Okay, got it. Yeah, so basically, yeah, a PR and the Google Doc Flem just send out, and then authorization policy. There's just a lot of discussion. Nothing being. There's no
Yes.
draft out yet.
Correct.
as far as I know, nobody's started a draft of that yet.
Got you. Yeah, thank you so much.
There was a lot of discussion about that last week. That that should be in the notes places where I thought we probably agreed and things that we probably don't so much agree on yet. Yeah. Keith apparently couldn't be here, so I'm a little, sorry. Keith apparently could not be here, which is too bad because I was kind of curious to see if he'd made any progress in surveying things and finding use cases.
I mean, yeah, is that something? So it sounds like you had some conversation with Keith. Is that something that there's kind of broader interest that would be worth sharing with the group, like collecting experience?
Oh, I had a conversation with Keith to the tune of 30 seconds on Slack with him saying, "Oh yeah, I'm not going to be able to make it today." Right. That was so nothing substantive there, I'm afraid.
But yeah, just for the general topic though, is that something that I know that you did that like HackMD doc a while ago of trying to like sketch out some use cases that we want to like make sure that we're addressing as part of this. That's something we should try to flesh out further.
So I'm hearing two questions there. One of them is, do I think we should try to flesh out use cases for Auth2Z? And the answer to that one is absolutely. But I'm also thinking that we should probably revisit, because if you look back at the HackMD doc originally, that was actually trying to flesh out a case where we had both a north-south gateway and a service mesh. And that's possibly also worth, revisiting a bit more. I know that John did a later cut at that. And I remember reading John's and thinking that overall, I thought it made a certain amount of sense. Now, of course, I'm spacing on exactly the details, so I should go back and reread that. Yeah, I'm
Can I
not
ask
sure.
something? It's
Yeah, go ahead.
only maybe vaguely related, but in a typical Linkerd deployment, as far as I know, Linkerd doesn't have its own gateway, so you use something else. Do you then put a Linkerd sidecar on that gateway, or does the gateway know enough about Linkerd to use like MPLS?
In Linkerd, the Ingress is just another workload. And it's actually been really fascinating to me to hear some of the discussion in this group and to realize that for a lot of meshes, that is not the case, that the Ingress is always something special. But from Linkerd's perspective, it's literally just another workload. And so, yeah, it gets a proxy next to it.
Okay, got it. So, okay.
Interesting, yeah, because for console, it's the gateways are deployed and they're very much like understand how to integrate directly with console rather than being treated like through that separate hop. Yep.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
even Emissary Ingress knows how to integrate with console for service discovery, but not so much for the for being part of the mesh. So I'm very accustomed to the Ingress just being another workload from the perspective of the mesh, and I find that it makes a ton of things really, really easy and simple. It kind of makes things a little bit more interesting, though, when you start thinking about how the north-south configuration and the east-west configuration should interact.
Yeah, so that means that you can have basically the gateway and then the gateway sidecar both do their own routing, right? But I would guess that typically that doesn't really happen because the gateway will resolve to a specific pod IP typically, and then
It
Linkerd
depends
just
on
forwards
the.
it.
It
I mean,
depends
not
on the
always, but
gateway.
that's like kind of a
Yeah.
common case, I would imagine.
There are kind of two common cases, but actually, let me back up a moment. The overarching common case is that as a practical matter, we trust the gateway and the service mesh not to fight over routing, if that makes any sense. So you absolutely could configure it so that the Ingress chose one service and then the mesh took over the routing and sent it someplace completely different. And we basically treat that as a weird edge case that is possible, not really supported. Why in the world would you do that? We work, if a Linkerd proxy sees that the Ingress or anybody else really has chosen to speak directly to an endpoint, Linkerd assumes that the thing that chose the endpoint knows what it's doing, and it will secure that traffic, but it won't try to route it. If a workload speaks to a cluster IP, then the proxy next to that workload will route it. Did that make sense?
Makes perfect sense. Thank you.
Yeah. So it's kind of a way of arranging it so that we have the flexibility to support a lot of different use cases. And yeah, you do therefore end up with some use cases that are kind of nonsensical, but you could do them.
Yeah, that makes sense. If I can, I'm not sure I'm going to be able to explain this well, but I will try. So some of the challenges I've been thinking of is like, once we have both north, south, and east, west, what do we do, right? And there's kind of two logical things. Like in one case, you have, similar to your setup, where you have two things that can route along each request. And in that case, it could make sense to have the gateway just say like, I'm only going to do the bare minimum routing to pick the service that I want to send to. So that's probably like, /foo goes to foo service or foo.example.com goes to foo service. Absolutely nothing else. Like you would never see a canary there, probably no header manipulation.
Well,
And
or
then
if
at
you
the
do,
second layer,
sorry, go ahead.
yeah, and then at the mesh layer, then that's where you add all the stuff. Like now that I've picked my service, what happens to it? Maybe I'm traffic splitting it. Maybe I'm adding headers. Maybe all these other things, which kind of makes sense. And let me explain the alternative, which I think is probably clear. But then I'll explain why I kind of have some issues with that. The alternative, of course, is that both the mesh and the gateway have all the routing information that they need. If you want a canary, you put it in both places. Maybe that's one config that somehow applies to both. Maybe that's two different configs. We'll have to decide on that. And then you do one or the other, right? If it's coming from the gateway, you don't apply the mesh routes. And if it's coming from directly in the cluster, you apply the mesh routes, which is something that could be done in Linkerd as well with that model, because if the gateway is picking a pod IP, that's fine. It just passes it through, right?
Yep, that would work.
And of course, that's the model that you would use on a traditional, like the EastGeo console wave, where you don't have a sidecar next to the gateway. So both options kind of make sense, but one concern I have with the kind of two-tier routing approach is that if you're trying to transition from having just north-south to then also adding a mesh, it becomes a bit less clear. You have to if you want to add mesh logic, then you have to go likely change your gateway logic as well. Unless we say that both options are valid and like you can say on the back end, send to the pod and send to the service. So you're kind of just declaring which one you want.
Yeah.
Which I think maybe is what we want, actually. I don't know. I'm kind of talking
Well,
circles now, but hopefully what I said made sense.
It actually did. And that second one that you described where, you know, the ingress could decide, the ingress can effectively choose by deciding whether it routes to a cluster IP or whether it routes to an endpoint. That's a pretty familiar model to me, actually.
Yeah, like for lack of a better API, like if we said backend reference to a service, if we called it service backend or service front end, like you can choose which layer you hit at.
Right.
Yeah.
The reason, let's see. Okay, so first off, I shall lay my bias firmly on the table, which is that I kind of like the way Linkerd does things. That's why I'm at Buoyant, right? You know, but one thing that I like about it, one thing that I like about doing things that way is that the ingress doesn't have to do a lot of special mesh custom logic because the ingress is being treated just as a workload. But it also does give you a neat way to separate concerns between somebody worrying about, I don't know, API routes that are visible to the outside world and external facing policy, and somebody who's only worried about things like, oh, hey, a new version of this thing deep in the call graph is coming out, so let me canary that one for a little bit, right? One interesting use case that we ran across just recently was one where the distinction between an A/B test of a user-facing thing in the UI and a canary deployment of a service deep in the call graph. And arranging for those to also be separated concerns can be kind of powerful in some senses.
So are your users taking like a specific gateway route and they're deciding like this should go to the front end or the back end, and therefore I should apply mesh rules or I shouldn't?
So I'll pick on emissary ingress for a moment, where a person deploying emissary ingress gets to decide whether emissary will choose an endpoint as the destination or whether it will just choose a service as the destination. And choosing services is simpler, so people who can barely spell Kubernetes are much more comfortable with that. And there's a ton of emissary users at that level. But there are also a ton of emissary users who are Kubernetes experts, and they may want to do sticky sessions and fancy load balancing algorithms and things like that, in which case they'll set it up to route to an endpoint. So I do actually see both use cases in, you know, I saw them both in the field a lot. A lot, probably most of those users were not explicitly thinking of a service mesh in the process, though.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think it generally, like to me, it's at least for so one thing as well, like the routing to the front end thing, that's very hard to do with the console Istio sidecar model. But it's something that obviously Linkerd can do, probably Cilium can do, and Istio can do it with the ambient model in the future.
Mm-hmm.
So like with that,
I think Cilium,
like,
yeah, I think Cilium can do it too, but I'm not 100% sure.
There's one thing that's weird. So currently, Console API Gateway actually does this model, where we're routing to the service, which is, I think it's difficult to do in a more flexible and portable way. Like the sidecar makes it very intuitive separation of concerns of it bounces to the sidecar, all that logic of translating service to mesh lives in the sidecar. Console API Gateway is our like service resolution is entwined with console. So when you target like a service that is present in the console mesh, it is resolved through that logic. So it is possible for us to do that like as a first party, like tightly integrated solution where you're deploying both Console API Gateway and console service mesh. It becomes much harder, or like I don't even know if it would be possible without like introducing new concepts to do this like in a portable way, like some other Gateway API north-south implementation into any of our meshes. Unless you're adding an extra hop through a sidecar, it becomes a lot more difficult.
Yeah, I wish I knew more about, I wish I remembered more about how Emissary interacts with Consul as a mesh. I mostly know how Emissary interacts with Consul as a service discovery mechanism.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, like that's one specific use case, just because I know that we have existing users
Actually,
that are deploying solutions like Emissary into console service mesh. So
you know what? I take it back. I do know that when we use, when people configure Emissary to use Consul for service discovery, if I recall correctly, we explicitly tell them that they are not allowed to then turn on the endpoint routing model, that they must use service routing.
okay,
I
Okay.
believe that that's true.
that makes sense.
Sorry,
Lynn,
Lynn.
question?
Yeah, can I ask something pretty dumb? I mean, I enjoy the discussion you had, but what I'm missing is how is this related to the authorization policy, whether you run a sidecar next to your ingress or not? Isn't that implementation detail that we could potentially hide from our user?
To me, this whole conversation was not about authorization policy. It was actually
Yeah.
about
Yeah.
routing.
Okay, that's what I was.
I'm typing the notes out to a new section.
Okay, okay. So, I mean, is this impact any of the API? That I guess that's my next question.
So
So
I don't
first off,
think a
I just
user-
updated the doc to reflect that this had nothing to do with Aussie, and
Okay.
yeah, that was a great catch. Thank you.
yeah, I think a user of the API should not need to know whether, there's like, I don't know, 4 different models that we have amongst all the vendors here. They probably shouldn't need to know about that. But those architectures do help us guide what the API should be, right? We can't make an API that's not implementable,
Right.
for example. So
For
it's
sure,
also useful
but
to know
yeah.
like the use cases. But from a user perspective, they shouldn't know. But from us as defining
Right.
the API, it's very important to know, I think.
Okay, yeah. So, what are the portions of API that would be impacted by whether you have a sidecar to the gateway or not? Is it by the front
If
end
we
and
said-
back end?
Yeah,
Go
like if
ahead.
we said in the East sidecar model that the gateway is routing to the service front end, like we couldn't implement that. We could in like the future with the ambient model, that's fine. We could with restrictions if we said like we're going to merge the routes, which based on the delegation stuff we know is quite hard to do for the entire spec, but can be done for a subset. But we can't generally implement it. So
I did not realize that that Istio couldn't do that at all, actually. So that
well,
is,
I mean, you could have, in theory, we could say, okay, sure, route to the service front end, but then we wouldn't also apply the mesh routes, right?
Yeah.
Because you'd have to do both layers of the routing in the same process. I mean, technically we could, like we could go make the gateway super complicated and like somehow do both routes. We said we can't
Yeah, but-
statically merge them, but technically we could like forward to ourselves. But that's like terrible.
yeah, that would be ugly.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah.
Thank you.
we could do it if we
That's
needed to,
important
but-
for me to know.
Yeah, and the thing is, like, also that's not our long-term architectural plans, but I don't
Mm.
think that anyone else is, or at least haven't publicly said that they're looking to switch from sidecars to kind of the ambient architecture or putting sidecars
it's
next to
not
gateways
ready.
like Linkerd. So
I mean, we
don't
do
wanna design
support
around-
putting sidecar, right? It's just not natively in Istio. Like if somebody wants to bring Nginx to work with Istio, I mean, Solo, we have Glue Edge, right? In order for those to work with Istio, you run a sidecar next to it. So we do support that model in Istio, just not what we ship
Kind of.
natively.
But
Yeah.
we also don't support routing to specific pod IPs directly. So it kind of destroys the whole sidecar next to a gateway model. But again, like that's also something we're going to fix. So I wouldn't design the API around that aspect, but designing it around the fact that you may have a gateway without a sidecar and then not have another mesh proxy in between. It seems likely at
Yeah.
least something we need to allow, right? That's a common architecture.
I think supporting both is important.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
Yeah.
When I said that, I meant not only not supporting.
Oh
that,
yeah,
but-
sorry, I was agreeing with you, not
Yeah.
implying that you said something else.
And I'm trying to capture this in notes, John, but feel free to edit things that I am expressing incorrectly. Constraints of Istio. Cool, so this
Yeah.
definitely is a helpful conversation to understand like the architectural models of different meshes and like finding a common set of concerns of like how we can or can't assume that these gateways might be integrated through a mesh. This definitely helps think about like what we can build, even if one may or may not be like more attractive for other reasons, like the simplicity of the separation of concerns or something like that. So. Well, I think kind of next steps for this is to definitely like take some of this discussion into the doc that I opened. So if folks want to start adding sections, it's the second thing of the meeting notes, the exposing mesh services through gateways, and start adding some of this context in here, specifically the constraints or deployment models of different meshes. That would be really helpful for helping to advance that, I think.
I actually had one other question
Yeah,
to put to the
yeah, go.
group here, which is, and we kind of talked about this, I feel like we talked about this some weeks ago, but to raise that one again, how useful or not do people think it is to allow configuring the north-south routes and the east-west routes separately? And I'm deliberately using the word route there because we're currently talking about HTTP route for both of them. When I wrote that original HackMD doc, it was kind of written from the perspective that supporting both of those was assumed to be a useful thing. And I'm a little unsure how I feel about that at this point, but I'm curious what other people think.
In my experience on Istio, it is common to want that. So like, let me reiterate. We have either routes on the gateway or for the mesh. Never do they both apply to the same request, right?
Got it.
So it's very common to have the same type of rules on both places, right? If you want a canary, you oftentimes want it regardless of where it's coming from, right? In the Istio API, it's theoretically possible to have one single route that applies to both, but it ends up being kind of tricky, and I doubt most users do it.
Got it.
In this model, I don't know if I ever added to a public doc or it was just my notes, but I had some crazy ideas on how it might be possible, but I don't think it's worth the complexity. Because oftentimes you end up with, even if they're very similar, they're slightly different, right?
Yeah.
Like, sure, I might want the canary part, but on the ingress, I'm matching foo.example.com, and on east-west, I'm matching it cluster IP, or I'm matching /foo and rewriting it on the ingress, but I don't have that internal path or something like that. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that they end up being very similar, and they both need to be configured, but they're slightly different. In practice is what I see a lot. Now, if you did have like the two-tier model, maybe you get rid of some of that duplication.
Potentially,
anyway. Other
anyway.
issues that we discussed, yeah.
Yeah.
That was the model that I felt would be most attractive. Like I feel like it's less common to expose a service directly at the root on the gateway, like at a host name or something like that. But you might want to like direct traffic from /admin or /cart or something like that to follow the same rules as resolving that service within the mesh. That's kind of what it feels like. Adding route delegation for north-south into there kind of enables a cleaner way to reuse a route for both purposes and be able to isolate some stuff like a filter or whatever you may, or like a host name or whatever, or that you may have like at that top level of the gateway config, kind of to match the spirit of the model that Flynn was talking about, that separation of concerns of a operations team that's concerned with traffic entering the mesh and that real gateway ingress administration versus the like mesh service owner as likely a separate team.
I do
And that-
think we have users using different routes for north-south and east-west routes. So for instance, user might want to have dark launch or maybe canary test just for internal user first, right? In the internal services first
interesting.
without exposing to the gateway. And also there's like maybe jot processing differently on the gateway with the internal routes. So that could potentially be different. I think we had a user have requested like the services from external, from the clients outside of the cluster was inside of the cluster. They want to handle jot the sessions differently. So that potentially results in different route rule as well. So I think there's definitely some value to have it separately if they choose to.
Okay.
I definitely like the jot off on the public ingress and
Yeah.
assuming mesh authentication internally, like that was one of
That's a
the
big-
very specific things I was thinking of that like route delegation can enable.
Yeah.
John?
Well, sorry, go ahead, John.
Yeah, go ahead, Flynn. No, I'm going to switch topics. So
Oh, okay. No switching topic. Yeah, basically my experiences lines up pretty similarly with Lynn's, I think, where we do see people wanting to do different things at, different levels. So I think I think we're seeing that this is something that we should support. Is that you see some broad consensus there? I guess the question is trying to arrange it to not be ridiculously complex if you don't need it. Go ahead, John.
yeah, I was just going to say kind of I don't know, meta point, I guess. So we talked a lot about like what we think users do and what makes sense to them. And we have all these we have actually a few like concrete different ideas on how things can work. Is there some way that we can like do a survey of users? Like, does this make sense to you, or like which one makes more sense to you? I feel like that may help. Like I can only guess what my users know so much. I don't know like what kind of, how we do that in Kubernetes
Yeah,
land.
that's
I think it's
actually a really good idea. I think maybe when we have some of the initial API, we can build some example and maybe run some survey program with the user. I think most user would be able to understand the API if there's an example. If it's just API without example, it's too hard for them. They wouldn't spend the time to manually build the example. They would just walk away.
Yeah, I was thinking like we'd have maybe two options side by side. Like here's one HTTP route or one set of HTTP routes, and here's another set. Here's like semantically how it works on this one. Here's how it works on this one. Which one do you prefer? Like notes, I don't know, something along those lines.
Yeah.
I think it might also make sense in that one to ask, sorry, let me phrase that differently. I could see a place in such a survey for a more open-ended question of, okay, so how would you, what sorts of things do you see doing differently at north-south and east-west levels and things like that? But I actually really like the idea of providing some examples and seeing what people think. And I have no idea how to do that survey. So I don't know. I suppose the obvious thing is we set up a Survey Monkey or something like that, and then figure out to whom to send it. But
yeah, I mean, we can leverage social media, right? It's, now that many of us are CNCF projects, so we can also ask each project to tweet about this, and then
right.
I'm guessing that there's someone that has the perfect answer on how to do this, and they're just not in this room.
Well, I was going to
So
say,
I bet we can find someone.
There are folks at Buoyant I can ask for suggestions, so I will take that item.
Cool. Yeah, I'm sure there's some Kubernetes or CNCF process that we can do it. Obviously, we could just make a survey our own, but if there's ways to get a wider audience or even someone that knows how to do a survey, I don't. So Yeah, okay, cool. I don't know if we're ready for that, but eventually I think that'll be useful. Maybe even for
Yeah.
Gateway in general, not just for Mesh. I don't know if we've ever done any surveys. Maybe it's too late for that and we just have to accept what we've done, but
Yeah, I think that when we have one or two the enhancement proposal, if we have example, we can try to run a survey and see if we can get some good feedback or useful feedback.
I think one of the
That would
tricky things,
help us iterate. Yeah, go ahead.
I think one of the tricky things too is making sure to be able, like, and that's why, I think trying to see if there's anybody in the Cube ecosystem that like knows how to do this well is making sure that we can do it in like a vendor neutral way, so that we get
Yeah.
perspectives from console users, Istio users,
Totally,
users,
yeah. Yeah,
and
I
get
think the
different
key is I totally agree with you. I think the key is focus on the API, but not so much focusing on the project. It's because we want to focus on the
Makes
user
sense.
case, right? And the API.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Agreed. Cool. Sounds like we have some next steps there to kind of figure out how to do that effectively. We might be a little early on it, but it seems like a valuable thing to do as we're trying to get this to take shape.
We're certainly not too early to be thinking about it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I know Cilium did a service mesh beta program. I think they have like 3,000 participants. So it might be useful to run some program where we just ask people for feedback. Yeah.
John, did you have a different topic, or was your different topic talking about a survey?
no, I think it was just a survey.
Okay.
But I'm happy to talk about anything.
Was there something we wanted to go back to with Auth0? Lynn, did you have some questions around that?
I guess my main thing while reading the meeting minutes was, is there any contention on Auth0 as far as the attachment point? It wasn't clear to me. It seems there was no contention from what I'm reading from the notes. So, but I could be wrong.
It's hard because we don't have any concrete idea, so there's nothing to be contended about yet.
Okay.
Rest assured, once someone proposes something, there will be there will be some disagreement.
That feels like a good summary of like there is simultaneously like significant contention of like we're all over the place with a dozen different ideas, and there was very little contention on like starting with the baseline of let's ignore authn for now, assume service account as a common baseline, and we need a proposal of some sort that will eventually have more discussion over.
Got you.
Yeah, I guess
just
one.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead, Lynn.
Go ahead. No. I was
Okay.
saying
Yeah,
just
one
collecting what's
question
out there. Yeah, go ahead.
Is so I think we're all at least interested in Auth0, but is there anyone that is actively like going to start up writing a proposal? I know that we have a few folks on our end. I don't know if they're in the meeting. Yeah, it looks like at least one of them is that are starting to look at this. Are there others that are interested in kind of leading the design or a design? We may have multiple that we merge or something.
I'm definitely interested in the Auth0 stuff. I am not about to start off writing anything until after KubeCon. Or anything other than KubeCon stuff.
So I was saying I was also interested in the Auth0 stuff. So we are Google Istio security team. So we are also checking the Gamma Auth0.
And Liwan says that she's interested too in chat.
Awesome.
All right, well, that's good. We have more than 0 people that are doing it because we need someone to start the doc, and then we can get the discussions going and make other docs or iterate on it, whatever. But I think it's useful to get something out there. So,
well, if somebody other
comes
than
up
me
with a initial proposal, please bring it up in the future meetings.
if somebody other than me starts off before KubeCon, that will be lovely. Otherwise, then we should talk about it after KubeCon. Or talk about the possibility of writing proposals there after KubeCon.
Yeah, in terms of KubeCon, I know last week you guys discussed about is there any get together on KubeCon? Do we have any?
I think we were talking about trying to get together sort of after Service Mesh Con wraps on Tuesday. Do we have
Okay.
any- Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
that's still
Okay.
the plan.
So yeah, I do know the Istio community is planning a meetup after Service MeshCon in that evening. I mean, probably would be two vendor specific, two project specific for you guys. Yeah, so maybe we can meet right after Service MeshCon before one community meetup.
Works for me.
Yeah.
This is the last one of Service Mesh Con, so now you guys have to stick around for it. So it works for me.
Oh yeah, your panel is the last, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
My actual talk is like the end of the day on Friday. So I
Oh,
got
good
the,
luck.
the unlucky straw.
Sorry,
Oh,
I won't be
no.
there then. Yeah, but I'll watch the recording. That's yeah.
Yeah, that's when I learned all my other talks were at EnvoyCon, which is always Monday, of course. It's my first time seeing an actual KubeCon talk, and now I realize that I should go back to the sub conventions.
Is that a
Yeah.
maintainer track talk or is that something else? where you-
No, it's I actually was the co-chair for Service Mesh track. Yeah, John, your talk was rated very high, so we are very happy to have it accepted as part of the KubeCon process.
So
Oh, well,
happy
it's
that they
just,
put it on Friday.
Well, you know, so there's two. There's the panel one at Service Mesh Con, which is not really my talk. I was just invited on the panel, and then me and Keith are giving one about Gamma actually on Friday. So
Yeah,
Nice.
so that's the KubeCon. So don't be frustrated on Friday because last KubeCon, Mitch Connor gave a talk on Friday. It was full room, and it was Friday
I know, so now I have to
afternoon.
live up to that
So
now.
so
I have no
yeah, you get
excuses.
all. Yeah, you get enough people, so don't worry.
Yeah, we just need to make some progress on Gamma, so I can say that we made progress on our slides instead of just sitting here every Tuesday. We haven't done anything other than shoot the shit and.
Yeah, actually, since you are speaking, John, we should actually try to line up the survey so that we can ask the KubeCon attendee to do the survey for API. I think that would be really good.
Yeah,
a good
that would
idea.
probably be good.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Because that's the best place to get data to. Yeah, with like 7,000 people attending KubeCon.
All right.
Yeah, that's a good
well,
idea. I want to make sure we somehow get as well like experts and noobs. Because
Definitely.
both of them have just
Well,
opinions
KubeCon's
there.
a pretty good place for that too, right?
Yeah.
I just realized that only one of the things I have to do for KubeCon is on my calendar. So now I'm completely screwed and I don't remember when my various talks are.
That's an easy problem.
Time to go
Check out
fix
the agenda.
that.
Well, good luck to everyone giving talks or preparing workshops or other such things. Yeah, I guess with that, it feels like we're mostly at the end of our agenda, so maybe wrap this up 10 minutes early. That sounds good to folks.
Works for me.
Yeah, thanks everybody.
Hey guys.
Thank
All
you.
right. Thanks, y'all. Take care. Have a good day.
Have a good
Take
one.
care.
Bye.